Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. It's great to take a last call on the last day of this Parliament. I'd like to acknowledge all the members and wish them a Merry Christmas and a happy and safe summer break. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this bill we have in front of the House. I'd like to acknowledge the Select Committee, the Chair, the submitters. I think it's fair to say we had a small number but high quality submissions in the Select Committee. So Mr. Speaker, this bill was a very simple mechanism. You have to wonder why it's the most pressing item of business on the government's agenda on the last day of Parliament, but Mr. Speaker, it's still a bill the Green Party will be supporting no matter how small it is. Basically what the government's doing in this legislation is taking the cost for New Zealand's offshore oil reserves, which are currently held on a ticket system. Most of it's currently in Japan. It comes out of general Crown expenditure, and what the government wants to do is through the fuel excise levy, then the road user charges, place a per litre price on oil and oil products, so those costs of having those oil stocks are seen transparently. Why is the government doing it? Well, first of all, it's important that New Zealand does have an oil reserve. I'd argue it'd be better to have it onshore in New Zealand, but there is an oil reserve which is part of our International Energy Agency obligations to deal with oil shocks, as we've seen have recurred throughout the decades. The government's decided to do this move in part because of the rising costs of having those oil reserves. Government official advice looks at about a $5 million per annum cost, increasing to $10 million in financial year 2016-17. But also, and the officials note this in the small print, which is we're seeing domestic oil production declining in the medium term. Traditionally, some of the New Zealand oil reserves were counted a part of the oil stocks for International Energy Agency reasons. However, with the declining reserves of oil in New Zealand, in fact, we're having to increase the offshore stocks. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reiterate the importance of having those stocks, but when the officials looked at the guidance, this cost of having it onshore, which is what I understand Air New Zealand were arguing in favour of, it was only $24.3 million, so an affordable cost in the context of $8 billion of annual fuel import bills. Now, Mr. Speaker, the real question I think this Parliament should be asking is the tinkering we're seeing in the House tonight on the last day of the government's 50th Parliament. Why are we spending this money on storing oil? 51st Parliament, well, Mr. McIndoe, thank you very much. Time does fly. Why should we be spending this money on storing oil stocks offshore? Surely we could be spending this money domestically in New Zealand, reducing the very cause of the problem it's trying to address, which is our high dependence on oil and the clear economic impacts this can have. So we support the bill. We think costs should lie where they fall. We think there's a greater argument for transparency. It's going to add an economic signal, which is when people do fill up at the pump, obviously someone has to pay for those fuel stocks being held in reserve, for those recurring fuel crises we've seen again and again. Now, it's pretty minor. It's only less than half of 1 cent per litre, but it is an economic signal all the same. One big concern which we tried to address in the Select Committee, unfortunately the government members didn't want to act on, was that biofuels, including domestically created biofuels, come under this. Now, I agree with Z Energy, one of our largest petroleum retailers. It's pretty absurd that biofuels, which are more sustainable, which decrease our dependence on oil, increase our resiliency, are going to be charged at exactly the same rate as oil. It sends the wrong economic signal to biofuel investors, biofuel consumers, and it does nothing to increase our resiliency in New Zealand. Now, there's also an equity argument, and I agree with Z Energy that it is unfair that other petroleum products such as LPG, jet fuel and bitumen aren't going to face this very small charge, yet biofuels are. So it seems that the government doesn't quite understand the role of markets and how we can be using market and price signals to incentivise good behaviour. And in this case, we're actually disincentivising sustainable biofuels, which are good for New Zealand, good for the economy and good for consumers. Now, that wider elephant in the room, which isn't being addressed with this tinkering bill on the last day of the government's Parliament, is there is still 6 years on since the last oil shock, no plan to reduce our dependence on oil. There's no plan to even start planning under National. When you look across the country, there are councils like Otago, Dunedin City Council. When you look across the economy, there are businesses. When you look across the world, there are countries and even militaries like the Pentagon, the world's single largest petroleum user, who are actively planning and taking steps to reduce their dependency on oil. New Zealand is the only country in the world which seems to be hell-bent on simply creating more oil. They've got an oil production strategy, no oil reduction or resiliency strategy. And this is the big strategic economic issue facing our country. When you look in the host of issues facing us, it's one of the big ones. Now, we spend in New Zealand about $8 billion, billion with a B, importing oil from offshore. That's about the equivalent of our entire tourism industry. So, Mr. Speaker, we've got tens of thousands of people doing great work in our tourism sector across the country, bringing Kiwis down to enjoy our hospitality and foreigners in New Zealand. But the fact is our entire tourism industry basically is only paying for the oil import bill. Mr. Speaker, that's madness. We should be increasing our economic resiliency, our diversifying our economy, and not just having one of our major economic sectors simply paying for the petrol bill. When you look at the impact on New Zealand's economy, we're incredibly vulnerable to high and rising oil prices. We're one of the most dependent economies in the world. I know when I looked at our vehicle fleet a few years ago, our average vehicle age in New Zealand is about 11.7 years, one of the oldest vehicles fleets in the world. We drive some of the shortest kilometres in the Western world, and Mr. Speaker, we drive with some of the fewest passengers. So we're incredibly oil reliant. My office did some analysis a few years back, and we found for every US $1 increase in the price of a barrel of oil, it wiped or shaved $40 to $60 million off New Zealand's GDP. We've seen oil being a major driver of recessions through the last 6 odd decades. And when you look at the last great oil shock in 2008, which in part played a significant role in the GFC, what Kiwis found is they wanted to be able to keep doing things and undertaking economic activity. In the face of high oil prices, they had no options. So in Wellington, commuters flocked to the public transport system because they wanted to avoid high oil prices, but they were out of luck because there was such limited capacity. In fact, in Wellington, we literally went to the museum to get rail units out of the museum to put on the tracks to cater for the increase in commuters. In my hometown of Gisborne, exporters wanted to put their products on the local rail line to get them to market to face high and rising oil prices. But what they found was the rail line had closed thanks to National's inactivity, and now it's closed for good. Across the country, people wanted to get to work or school on their bikes to get fit and save money. But what they found was there was no safe cycling infrastructure out there. They didn't feel it was safe. So people felt trapped because the government wasn't giving them options to escape high and rising oil prices. And this slight marginal increase in the price of a litre of oil to pay for our offshore oil stocks isn't going to make a shred of difference. Now, this bill also does not take into account climate change. This is the greatest global environmental threat. The International Energy Agency, an agency we subscribe to, that the government actually contributes money towards, are advising us that we can't afford to burn 70% of the oil reserves we've already discovered, let alone looking for more deep off our oceans, as we've invited Chevron to do yesterday. We can't afford to burn 70% of the stuff we've already found if we want a safe and stable climate for our kids. So, Mr. Speaker, instead of this tinkering, what the Green Party has been advocating is real solutions for Kiwis, better ideas for the New Zealand economy. We'd like to see greater action on electric cars. For a country close to 100% renewables, we could be helping save consumers money. The equivalent to filling a tank of petrol with an electric vehicle is about $30. $30 versus, say, $150. We should be giving Kiwis better options for public transport, such as the CBD rail link for Auckland, better buses, cleaner buses, cheaper buses for Wellington, and clean energy. And imagine what kind of country we'd have. A more resilient country, a nicer country in terms of nicer places to live, healthier places to walk and cycle without the smoke and pollution and particulates which are killing hundreds of us every year. We'd see more jobs, more development. Mr. Speaker, in short, the green smart solutions to deal with one of the big issues of our age will lead to a richer New Zealand in all the terms it encompasses. Merry Christmas to you, Mr. Speaker, and Merry Christmas to all the members of Parliament and the public.